Lillian Lorraine was the ultimate Broadway icon, a dazzling queen whose youth was ruthlessly used up and replaced by the Ziegfeld machine. At her peak, her billionaire patron rented an entire Manhattan hotel floor just for her dogs. Yet behind the velvet curtains, she drank herself into a stupor every night, terrified of the 18-year-old girls auditioning to take her place. When a drunken fall shattered her spine, the elite simply shifted the spotlight, leaving this diamond-draped goddess to spend her final 30 years crippled and forgotten in a foul-smelling rooming house. A brutal reminder that when you sell your beauty to capitalism, you cannot complain when your expiration date arrives. But before a woman can be thrown away, she must first be manufactured. We must step into the glittering arena that set her price. The dynamic between Lillian Lorraine and Florenz Ziegfeld was not a romantic love affair. It was a high-stakes corporate merger where one party held all the capital. The rigid, suffocating morality of the Victorian age was dying, replaced by the roaring engines of industrial wealth and a new, insatiable appetite for public spectacle. New York City was transforming into a playground for the incredibly rich railroad barons, Wall Street titans, and industrial tycoons who possessed fortunes so vast they defied mathematical comprehension. But wealth without display is meaningless in the upper echelons of society. These men, bloated with new money and unearned arrogance, needed a place to showcase their dominance, to spend their fortunes, and to consume the finest things the world had to offer. Florenz Ziegfeld Jr. built them the perfect amphitheater. The Ziegfeld Follies were not merely theatrical reviews. They were an industrial assembly line of female perfection. Ziegfeld was a pioneer of commodification, a man who understood long before Hollywood did that sex, packaged with high society elegance and an aura of exclusivity, was the ultimate product. He didn't just cast women, he curated them, molded them, and branded them. The Ziegfeld girl was an archetype meticulously designed to be the apex of American beauty, unattainable, flawless, and completely stripped of threatening autonomy. They were draped in imported pearls, adorned with towering, brightly colored ostrich feathers, and paraded down grand, sweeping staircases to be consumed by the hungry, assessing eyes of the men in the orchestra seats. In this world, a woman's face and body were her only currency. It was an environment that promised young women the world, provided they never aged, never gained weight, never spoke out of turn, and never ceased to be objects of absolute fantasy. Into this glittering, predatory meat grinder walked Lillian de Jacques. Born in San Francisco in 1892, her early life was dictated by the classic, tragic trope of the fiercely ambitious stage mother. Marianne Brennan, Lillian's mother, recognized her daughter's startling physical potential long before the girl understood it herself. In an era where options for working-class women were limited to grueling factory labor or domestic servitude, beauty was a lottery ticket, and Marianne intended to cash it in. Lillian's childhood was effectively stolen, replaced by endless vocal lessons, dance classes, and the harsh discipline of the vaudeville circuit. By her early teens, Lillian had been relentlessly molded, polished, and rebranded. She shed her birth name, with its ethnic and working-class connotations, and adopted a far more elegant, lyrical, and marketable moniker, Lillian Lorraine. She was pushed eastward, away from the devastation of the 1906 San Francisco earthquake, toward the bright, unforgiving lights of Broadway, arriving in New York City just as Florenz Ziegfeld was building his legendary empire. In 1907, at a casting call buzzing with hundreds of desperate hopefuls, Florenz Ziegfeld saw Lillian for the first time. The producer was a man of legendary, almost pathological appetites, notorious for his predatory eye and his deep-seated need to control the women he employed. Ziegfeld was not a fool. He knew immediately that the 15-year-old Lillian was neither a classically trained singer nor a technically gifted dancer. Her voice was somewhat thin, lacking the operatic power of the era's great divas, and her movements lacked the rigid discipline of a prima ballerina. But Ziegfeld didn't sell discipline, and he certainly didn't sell vocal technique. He sold allure. He sold the promise of something forbidden. And Lillian had an intoxicating, almost dangerous magnetism that could not be taught in any studio. She possessed a striking dark beauty that stood out violently in a sea of homogeneous bleach-blonde chorus girls. Her features were sharp and aristocratic, her eyes heavy-lidded, dark and deeply seductive, and she carried herself with a vivacious, reckless energy that commanded the attention of every man in the room. She didn't just walk onto a stage, she owned it with a brazen, almost insolent confidence that bordered on arrogance. She looked at the audience not with the desperate plea for approval common to most performers, but with a daring challenge. Ziegfeld was instantly, irreversibly mesmerized. He immediately plucked her from the obscurity of the chorus line, thrust her into the very center of his follies, and began the aggressive, calculated campaign of making her the most famous desired woman in America. Overnight, Lillian Lorraine became a national sensation. She was the undisputed star of the 1909 Follies, introducing the massive hit song By the Light of the Silvery Moon. The public adored her. The critics, usually harsh on girls with limited vocal range, tripped over themselves to praise her ethereal beauty and her undeniable stage presence. And Ziegfeld became entirely dangerously obsessed with her. At the time, Ziegfeld was famously involved with the French star Anna Held, the woman who had essentially provided the blueprint for his success. But he cast Held aside with a ruthless efficiency to focus his entire fortune and attention on Lillian. He showered the teenager with a level of wealth that bordered on the obscene, the cascading diamonds, the sprawling penthouse suites, the custom motor cars, the gold-threaded chinchilla coat. These were not merely gifts of deep romantic affection. They were tactical, calculated displays of ownership. When Ziegfeld rented that entire floor of the magnificent Ansonia Hotel for her dogs, the public gasped at the romance and the fairy tale extravagance of it. The Ansonia, a Beaux-Arts masterpiece on the Upper West Side, was a palace of modern luxury, boasting indoor swimming pools, a rooftop farm, and pneumatic tubes in the walls for delivering messages. To rent an entire floor of this architectural marvel for mere animals was an act of staggering financial hubris. But look closely at the psychology of that gesture. It was not cute. It was not romantic. It was a terrifying, suffocating flex of financial dominance. Ziegfeld was broadcasting a loud, unmistakable message to the other millionaires of New York, to the press, and most importantly, to Lillian herself. I have so much money, so much absolute power that I can afford to waste it on the literal beasts of the woman I keep. She is mine. She exists because I allow her to exist in this sphere. He was meticulously building a golden cage around her, ensuring that she became entirely helplessly dependent on his wealth to maintain a lifestyle she could never, ever sustain on a standard Broadway salary. For a teenager thrust from working-class obscurity into this level of dizzying, mind-altering excess, the illusion of power is absolute and blinding. Lillian threw money away with a careless, almost manic joy that only a child who has never truly known the crushing weight of poverty can manage. She believed that the men bowing to her in restaurants, the bankers sending her emeralds, and the politicians kissing her hand were bowing to her intellect, to her spirit, to her invincible essence. She did not yet have the maturity or the cynicism to understand that they were merely renting the smooth, unblemished skin of her face. She was intoxicated by the spotlight, convinced that she had beaten the system, that she was the exception to the rule. But behind the heavy, dust-filled velvet curtains, inside the suffocating privacy of her dressing room, the psychological horror of her existence was beginning to take a deep, insidious root. Lillian was not a partner in the Ziegfeld empire. She was its most high-end, expensive, and fragile asset. And the fundamental, inescapable flaw of being valued solely for your physical perfection is that physical perfection is entirely, cruelly temporary. The vanity mirror in a Broadway dressing room is a ruthless, unforgiving interrogator. Every night, as she sat beneath the harsh, glaring heat of the vanity bulbs to apply her heavy grease paint, Lillian was forced to confront the terrifying fragility of her position. She knew the brutal mechanics of the Ziegfeld machine better than anyone. She knew that while she was carefully applying rouge to maintain the illusion of perpetual youth, Florenz Ziegfeld was sitting in a plush office just a few doors down, auditioning hundreds of eager, flawless 18-year-old girls, fresh off the trains from Ohio, Pennsylvania, and Kansas. They were hungry, they were cheap, they were desperate, and most importantly, they were new. The psychological pressure of this reality was crushing, a physical weight on her chest. Lillian lived in absolute, paralyzing terror of the first sign of a wrinkle, the first stray gray hair, the first morning she woke up looking tired or bloated. In the high society of the 1910s, a woman's aging process was not viewed as a natural biological function. It was viewed as a breach of contract, a personal failure, an insult to the men who paid to look at her. She was expected to be a static object of desire, frozen in a perpetual state of blooming maidenhood. To maintain this impossible, agonizing standard and to cope with the relentless, vibrating anxiety of being a product on a shelf with an approaching, unspoken expiration date, Lillian turned to the only reliable comfort available in her opulent, shallow circle. She began to drink. It started as a social requirement, champagne flowing like water at the endless, opulent after-parties, hosted by the city's elite, where she was expected to be witty, charming, and accessible until dawn. But quickly, the alcohol became a medical necessity, a chemical shield against the terrifying reality of her life. She drank to blur the sharp, accusing edges of the dressing room mirror. She drank to numb the paralyzing fear of the 18-year-olds rehearsing in the next room. She drank to find the false courage to walk out onto the stage, face the blinding wall of the spotlight, and pretend that she was a goddess, rather than a terrified, deeply insecure girl, caught in a gilded trap she didn't fully understand. Her behavior, fueled by Prohibition-era liquor and the toxic environment of the theater, became increasingly erratic and self-destructive. The vivacious, reckless energy that had once charmed audiences mutated into a volatile, destructive temper. There were public, glass-shattering screaming matches with Ziegfeld in high-end restaurants. There were scandalous, highly publicized affairs with other wealthy men, desperately intended to provoke Ziegfeld's jealousy and test the limits of her power over him. There were explosive, diva-like outbursts during the rehearsals that delighted the tabloid press, who fed on her drama like vultures. She was living at a breakneck, unsustainable speed, burning the candle at both ends and throwing it into a bonfire, desperately trying to outrun the ticking clock of her own biology. She was convinced that the party would never stop because the powerful men paying for the liquor swore to her, night after night, that it wouldn't. But the men were lying. They always are. The golden chinchilla coat was never a shield against the cold, unforgiving world. It was a brilliantly disguised, incredibly heavy straitjacket. Lillian Lorraine had climbed, clawed, and dazzled her way to the absolute zenith of the American dream, only to slowly, painfully realize that the peak was a razor-thin precipice. She had successfully traded her youth, her autonomy, and her face for the wealth of the elite, genuinely believing she had conquered the system. But the system is designed to consume, not to be conquered. The alcohol was dulling her senses and eroding her beauty just as the harsh, unforgiving lights of Broadway were beginning to expose the first fatal cracks in her flawless facade. Florenz Ziegfeld was still smiling at her, still paying for the penthouse, but his eyes, those cold, calculating producer's eyes, were already drifting toward the wings, scanning the chorus line for the next fresh face. The tragedy of the scapegoat is not merely that she is sacrificed. It is that she is dressed in priceless jewels, crowned with feathers, and paraded through the streets to the sound of thunderous applause, completely, tragically unaware of the sharp blade waiting for her at the altar. The spotlight was already beginning to dim. The long, terrifying descent into the dark had just begun. To understand the exact mechanics of Lillian Lorraine's descent, we must look at the specific nature of her relationship with Florenz Ziegfeld. It is tempting to frame their dynamic as a tragic, sweeping romance, a tortured love affair between a visionary genius and his temperamental muse. But that is the Hollywood version of the story. The truth was far more clinical and far more sinister. Their relationship was not a romance. It was a high-stakes corporate merger where one party held all the capital and the other party was the depreciating asset. Ziegfeld did not love Lillian in any healthy human sense of the word. He loved what she represented. He loved the fact that when he walked into Delmonico's or Rector's with her on his arm, the most powerful men on Wall Street stopped eating to stare at his property. She was the ultimate status symbol, a living, breathing testament to his absolute power over the Broadway ecosystem. But a status symbol requires constant maintenance, and Lillian, for all her breathtaking beauty, was profoundly unmanageable. The very qualities that made her so magnetic on stage, her reckless energy, her brazen defiance, her refusal to be tamed, made her an exhausting liability behind closed doors. She was a teenager handed the keys to the kingdom without any instruction manual on how to rule it. Believing the illusion of her own invincibility, Lillian began to push back against the invisible bars of her golden cage. She mistook the indulgence of her patron for genuine autonomy. She wanted to prove that she was not merely a creation of Ziegfeld, but a power in her own right. Her methods of rebellion, however, were entirely self-destructive. She engaged in highly publicized, volatile affairs with other wealthy men, seemingly just to humiliate Ziegfeld in the tabloids. In 1912, in a fit of pique and desperate to assert her independence, she eloped with Friedrich Griesheimer, a man who possessed none of Ziegfeld's theatrical genius, but all of his controlling tendencies. The marriage was a spectacular disaster, characterized by physical abuse, public screaming matches, and an annulment that followed almost immediately. Lillian had tried to escape one possessive man by running into the arms of another, realizing too late that in the world she inhabited, men did not view her as a partner, but as a prize to be won and then locked away. Ziegfeld's reaction to her rebellions was chilling in its calculated patience. He did not fire her. He did not publicly condemn her. He simply watched her thrash against the machine. He understood the psychology of his creations better than they understood themselves. He knew that Lillian was hopelessly addicted not just to the alcohol, but to the applause, the diamonds, and the sheer dizzying altitude of her lifestyle. He knew she had no other marketable skills, no education, and no safety net. He could afford to let her play at independence because he knew with absolute certainty that she would eventually have to crawl back to the very system that was slowly destroying her. And she always did. When Lillian returned to the Follies after her disastrous escapades, the dynamic had shifted. The illusion of her power was fractured. She was still beautiful. She was still a star, but she was now heavily reliant on the bottle to maintain the facade. The schedule of a Broadway star in the 1910s was punishing. 8 shows a week, endless rehearsals, costume fittings, and the unspoken contractual obligation to attend the late-night parties, where the wealthy backers expected the girls to entertain them until dawn. To survive this grueling marathon, Lillian lived on a diet of champagne, exhaustion, and raw adrenaline. The physical toll was inevitable. The hangovers began to bleed into the performances. She missed cues. She forgot lyrics. There were nights when she was so heavily intoxicated that stagehands had to physically guide her to her marks before the curtain rose. The public, initially amused by her eccentricities, began to view her erratic behavior with a growing morbid fascination. She was transitioning in the public eye from a fascinating, untouchable diva to a tragic, unpredictable mess. But in the ruthless calculus of show business, a mess is still profitable as long as people buy tickets to see the wreckage. Ziegfeld kept her on stage, propping her up, squeezing the last drops of commercial viability out of her failing body. However, the Broadway machine does not tolerate unreliability forever. There's a specific agonizing protocol for how the system disposes of a woman whose expiration date is approaching. They do not hand you a pink slip. They do not pull you into a sterile office and explain that your contract will not be renewed. They fire you with silence. They fire you by looking past you. As the 1910s progressed, Lillian began to experience the unique, suffocating terror of the fading star. It started with subtle, almost imperceptible shifts in the theater's ecosystem. The lighting designer, under strict orders from management, began to adjust the harsh white spotlights, softening them to hide the tired lines around her eyes, a humiliating professional courtesy. Then came the shift in the repertoire. The show-stopping solo numbers, the songs that required a clear, strong voice and absolute command of the stage, were quietly reassigned to newer, fresher faces. This is the moment the true psychological horror of the industry reveals itself. Lillian was forced to share the dressing room corridors with the next generation of Ziegfeld girls, women like Olive Thomas, Justine Johnstone, and Marilyn Miller. These girls were exactly what Lillian had been a decade earlier, 18 years old, terrifyingly ambitious, flawless, and completely unaware of the meat grinder they had just stepped into. Lillian had to look into their bright, unblemished faces and see her own impending obsolescence reflected back at her. The Follies were a perfectly designed capitalist machine. The product was the Ziegfeld girl, and the fundamental truth of any manufactured product is that it is entirely replaceable. Ziegfeld didn't need Lillian Lorraine specifically. He just needed someone who looked and acted like the idea of Lillian Lorraine. When the original model became too difficult to maintain, too expensive to repair, and too damaged to display, he simply manufactured a new one, Lillian was not pushed off the stage. She was slowly, methodically edged into the shadows. Her name on the grand, illuminated marquees outside the New Amsterdam Theater grew smaller. The press agents stopped calling her sweet. The wealthy bankers who used to flood her dressing room with orchids began knocking on the doors of the younger girls. The transition was agonizingly slow. She was forced to participate in her own erasure, showing up every night to a theater that was systematically transferring her power, her identity, and her future to someone else. In her desperation, Lillian gripped tighter. She drank more heavily, her behavior becoming increasingly combative and desperate. She tried to demand the attention that used to be freely given, throwing tantrums that only served to solidify her reputation as a difficult, washed-up liability. She didn't understand that the system didn't care about her anger. The system only cared about ticket sales. When she ceased to be the primary reason men bought tickets, her feelings, her struggles, and her humanity became entirely irrelevant. She was learning the most brutal lesson of the American celebrity economy. When you sell your youth to the machine owes you nothing when you run out of inventory. She had traded the most vibrant, energetic years of her life for a temporary lease on a penthouse and a gold-threaded coat. She had believed the applause was a promise of loyalty, but the audience is never loyal to the actor. They are loyal only to the entertainment. When Lillian could no longer provide the flawless, effortless fantasy they demanded, they simply turned their heads to the next girl in line, leaving Lillian standing in the fading light, holding a glass of champagne she could no longer afford, waiting for a curtain call that was never going to come. The psychological collapse of Lillian Lorraine was complete long before her physical body gave out. The system had successfully extracted her youth, monetized her beauty, and quietly pushed her toward the exit door while she was too drunk to notice the locks being changed. She was a ghost haunting her own life, a woman walking through a city that had already decided she was a relic of a bygone era. The tragedy of the fading star is the agonizing gap between the loss of power and the acceptance of that loss. Lillian was still trying to live like a queen in a kingdom that had quietly deposed her. She was teetering on the edge of a precipice, blinded by the glare of the past, completely unaware that the ground beneath her had already vanished. She was navigating the stages of New York in a perpetual chemically induced haze, using Prohibition-era gin to artificially inflate a confidence that the industry had systematically dismantled. The machine was finished with her mind. It was now only a matter of time before the world broke her body. By the winter of 1922, the psychological rot that had been hollowing Lillian Lorraine out from the inside finally breached the surface. The human body is a resilient machine, but it cannot indefinitely sustain the punishing dual assault of severe alcoholism and the crushing, relentless terror of professional obsolescence. Lillian was 30 years old, an age that, in the brutal mathematics of the Ziegfeld Empire, rendered her a statistical antiquity. The Broadway machine had already extracted the most valuable years of her youth, monetized her flawless skin, and quietly begun to edge her towards the exit door. She was still performing, still desperately clinging to the fringes of the spotlight, but the performances were no longer triumphs. They were acts of sheer, exhausting survival. The catastrophic end of Lillian Lorraine's reign did not occur during a glamorous, highly publicized final performance. It did not happen under the grand proscenium arch of the New Amsterdam Theater amidst a shower of roses. It happened in the ugly, mundane reality of a drunken stupor. Historical accounts of the exact night vary slightly in their specifics. Some state she slipped on a patch of slick winter ice outside a speakeasy. Others suggest she tumbled backward down a steep flight of stairs during a frantic, intoxicated argument. But the specifics of the geography are entirely irrelevant. What matters is the velocity of the fall and the devastating permanence of the impact. When Lillian fell, she did not just bruise her ego or fracture a limb, she shattered her spine. The violence of that injury cannot be overstated. For a woman whose entire existence, economic survival, and public identity were predicated entirely on physical perfection, a shattered spine was not a medical crisis. It was an absolute, irreversible professional execution. Lillian was rushed to a hospital, a chaotic transition from the velvet and silk of her nightlife into the sterile, unforgiving glare of a surgical ward. The doctors delivered the prognosis with the cold, clinical detachment of men who deal in biology, not celebrity. She was severely paralyzed. The legs that Florence Ziegfeld had once heavily insured for astronomical sums, the legs that had marched down the grand, sweeping staircases of the Follies to the thunderous, obsessive applause of Wall Street bankers, were now entirely useless. They were dead weight, pinned beneath the crisp white hospital sheets. It is in the sterile silence of that hospital room that the true terrifying nature of the capitalist entertainment machine was laid bare. When a factory worker loses a limb in a thresher, the factory owner might send a sympathetic card, but he immediately replaces the worker on the assembly line to ensure the quotas are met. The Broadway of the 1920s operated on the exact same industrial principle. When Lillian Lorraine lay broken in her hospital bed, staring at the ceiling and grappling with the terrifying reality of her ruined body, the reaction of the New York elite was an exercise in breathtaking cruelty. There was no mass mobilization of wealth to save her. Florence Ziegfeld, the man who had once rented an entire floor of the Ansonia Hotel for her dogs, did not rush to her bedside to offer his fortune for her rehabilitation. He sent a polite, perfunctory arrangement of flowers, and then he immediately returned his attention to his new, flawlessly functioning assets. He had Marilyn Miller now. He had a fresh crop of 18-year-old girls from the Midwest who did not have broken spines and who did not require expensive, complex medical care. Ziegfeld was a businessman, and Lillian Lorraine was a depreciated, damaged asset that was no longer capable of generating revenue. The contract had expired the moment her vertebrae cracked. The most terrifying sound Lillian experienced during those long, agonizing months in the hospital was not the clatter of surgical instruments. It was the absolute deafening silence of the telephone. The entourage vanished overnight. The wealthy politicians, the industrial tycoons, and the bankers who had once violently competed for the privilege of buying her champagne and funding her extravagant lifestyle disappeared like smoke. They had not been investing in Lillian the human being, they had been renting proximity to her flawless aesthetic. Now that the aesthetic was permanently disfigured, the lease was canceled. The sycophants, the hanger-on, the fair-weather friends who had populated her penthouse suites and drained her liquor cabinets simply moved their operations to the dressing rooms of the younger, uninjured girls. Lillian was left entirely alone, isolated in a prison of her own failing biology, forced to confront the chilling realization that she had sold her youth to a system that felt absolutely no obligation to care for her in her infirmity. This is the juncture where the financial hemorrhage truly began. The transition from unimaginable wealth to grinding poverty is rarely instantaneous. It is a humiliating, slow bleed. During her peak years, Lillian had earned millions of dollars, adjusted for inflation, and she had been gifted millions more in jewels, furs, and real estate. But she had never been taught how to manage capital. The men who controlled her career preferred her financially illiterate, as it guaranteed her continued dependence on their patronage. When the weekly Broadway paychecks stopped arriving, the reality of her financial mismanagement became a crushing weight. The medical bills for her spinal surgeries, her specialized care, and her lengthy rehabilitation were astronomical. To cover the costs, the aggressive liquidation of her past began. The glittering gold-threaded chinchilla coat was sold to a broker for a fraction of its value. The heavy imported diamond necklaces, the emerald rings, and the pearl chokers that had once been the tactical markers of Ziegfeld's ownership were pawned to pay hospital administrators. She was systematically selling off the glittering armor of her youth just to survive the physical wreckage of her present. As her bank accounts drained, she was forced to downgrade her living situation, moving from the palatial, sprawling penthouses of Manhattan into smaller, increasingly unremarkable apartments. She was sliding backwards down the socioeconomic ladder she had spent her entire adolescence climbing. While Lillian was trapped in a painful, agonizingly slow physical rehabilitation, learning to walk again with a pronounced permanent limp that destroyed her signature stage grace, the world outside her window underwent a massive cultural revolution. The 1920s roared to life. The Jazz Age exploded into the American consciousness with a frantic, desperate energy. The culture was suddenly dominated by flappers, speakeasies, short bobbed hair, and a new aggressive brand of female sexuality. Lillian Lorraine, the woman who had effectively defined the parameters of American glamour just a decade prior, was suddenly violently obsolete. She had created the era, but the era had mercilessly moved on without her. She was a relic of the pre-war follies, a ghost of the Gilded Age, haunting a city that was obsessed with the future. She attempted brief, desperate comebacks, managing to secure minor roles in second-rate productions, based purely on the fading novelty of her name. But the audiences were no longer captivated. They looked at the woman on the stage, noting the stiff, painful gait, the thick makeup failing to conceal the deep, exhausted lines of her face, and the hollow, terrified look in her eyes. They did not see the Queen of New York. They saw a cautionary tale. The reviews were politely dismissive, the ultimate insult in a town that thrives on hyperbole. The industry was sending her a clear, undeniable message. The product line had been discontinued. The psychological devastation of this cultural abandonment finalized her absolute reliance on alcohol. If she could no longer be the center of the universe, she would drink until the universe ceased to exist. As the 1920s bled into the Great Depression of the 1930s, Lillian's descent accelerated. The national economic collapse wiped out whatever meager savings she had managed to preserve from the pawnbrokers. The city of New York, gripped by breadlines and mass unemployment, had no sympathy and no resources for a former showgirl who had squandered a fortune. She was just another hungry mouth in a city of millions, entirely stripped of the protective golden aura of her past. She continued to move, pushed by debt and eviction notices, into darker, cheaper, and more dangerous neighborhoods. The women who now passed her on the street did not stop to stare in envious awe. They did not recognize the stooped, limping woman in the threadbare, out-of-date coat. Lillian had become invisible. The ultimate punishment for a woman who was taught that her only value was being looked at was a life where no one bothered to look at her at all. She was entirely alone, trapped in a decaying body, armed with nothing but the agonizing, perfectly clear memories of a time when she had owned the world. The shattering of Lillian Lorraine's spine in 1922 was the physical manifestation of a contract termination. The capitalist entertainment machine had successfully mined the natural resource of her youth, refined it into unimaginable wealth for the men at the top, and promptly discarded the hollowed-out shell when the structural integrity failed. The agonizing surgeries and the pawning of the diamonds were merely the administrative costs of a bankrupt enterprise. Lillian was now entering the final, most terrifying phase of the American celebrity life cycle, the long, quiet rot. She had 30 years left to live, 3 decades of waking up every single morning, trapped in a broken body, in a city that worshipped the very youth she had surrendered. The spotlight had formally, permanently been switched off. The audience had gone home. The theater doors were locked, and Lillian Lorraine was about to begin her 30-year sentence in the absolute, suffocating dark. The 1930s descended upon America not just as an economic collapse, but as a violent cultural reckoning. The stock market crash of 1929 obliterated the vast, untouchable fortunes of the very men who had once purchased Lillian Lorraine's time, attention, and youth. But for Lillian, the Great Depression was merely a macrocosm of the personal devastation she had already endured. She did not lose her fortune in the crash. The Broadway machine in her own desperate, unguided hands had drained her accounts long before the banks closed their doors. However, the Depression did something far more insidious to her. It erased the world that remembered her. The extravagant, champagne-soaked New York of the Ziegfeld era was gone, replaced by breadlines, Hoovervilles, and a grim, collective desperation. The city could no longer afford to indulge in the memory of a pampered showgirl when its citizens were starving on the streets. To survive the sheer length of her fall, Lillian became a ghost. The curse of the fading star is not a sudden, dramatic death, but the agonizing endurance of survival. If she had died at 25, at the height of her Follies fame, she would have been immortalized as a tragic, glittering icon, frozen in amber like so many other casualties of early Hollywood and Broadway. Instead, she was condemned to live. She had to wake up every single morning for 3 decades, trapped in a body that was permanently broken, navigating a society that had systematically stripped her of her only currency. The physical transformation was the most brutal manifestation of her new reality, the face that Florenz Ziegfeld had used to build an empire, the face that had stared down from massive illuminated billboards in Times Square, began to surrender to the ravages of cheap gin and profound unmedicated trauma. The sharp aristocratic jawline softened and swelled. The heavy-lidded, seductive eyes grew hollow and frantic, framed by the dark, bruised circles of chronic insomnia and alcohol dependency. The pronounced limp from her shattered spine forced her into a hunched defensive posture, completely erasing the fluid, arrogant grace that had once commanded the New Amsterdam Theater. When she walked down the cracked pavements of Yorkville, a working-class enclave on the Upper East Side, where she eventually sought cheap shelter, she was entirely invisible. The pedestrians who hurried past her, heads down against the biting New York wind, did not see the Queen of Manhattan. They saw an aging, anonymous woman in a frayed, out-of-date wool coat, clutching a worn handbag. They did not know that the stooped woman waiting in line at the local grocer had once complained about the temperature of imported French champagne, or that a millionaire had once bought a fleet of motor cars simply to catch her eye. The absolute anonymity was a psychological torture that no amount of liquor could fully suppress. She was a prisoner trapped in the solitary confinement of her own spectacular memories. In 1932, a piece of news broke that must have felt like a final physical blow to whatever remained of her ego. Florenz Ziegfeld died. The great architect of the American showgirl, the man who had authored her rise and orchestrated her disposal, succumbed to pleurisy after losing virtually his entire empire in the financial crash. Ziegfeld died heavily in debt, surrounded by the chaotic wreckage of his business. Yet when he died, the world stopped to mourn him. The newspapers printed massive glowing obituaries detailing his genius, his vision, and his unparalleled contribution to American theater. He was remembered as a titan. Lillian was still alive, reading those same newspapers in a cold, drafty rooming house completely forgotten. The creator was immortalized, even in his financial ruin, while the creation was left to rot in absolute obscurity. It was the ultimate sickening proof of the capitalist dynamic that had defined her life. The man who owned the factory was a visionary. The woman who operated the machinery until her hands bled was simply overhead. When Ziegfeld died, the last tangible link to her golden era was severed. There was no one left who could truly verify that she had ever mattered at all. Her daily existence devolved into a grim, mechanical routine of survival. The woman who had once resided in the sprawling palatial penthouses of the Ansonia Hotel now lived in a succession of increasingly dismal single-room occupancies. These were not apartments. They were holding cells for the city's discarded. The sensory contrast alone would have been enough to drive a person mad. Instead of the scent of expensive tuberose perfume and fresh, out-of-season orchids, her world smelled of boiling cabbage, stale cigarette smoke, and the sharp chemical tang of cheap ammonia. Instead of the quiet pneumatic hum of luxury hotel service, she listened to the violent clanking of failing radiators, the arguments of desperate neighbors through paper-thin walls, and the relentless mechanical roar of the elevated trains rattling the single-pane windows. To pay for this miserable existence, she was eventually forced to endure the ultimate humiliation for a woman of her former stature. She applied for state welfare. Imagine the psychological violence of that transaction. Lillian de Jacques, universally known as Lillian Lorraine, the woman who had generated millions of dollars in revenue for the American theater, standing in a drab bureaucratic welfare office, waiting for a government clerk to stamp a piece of paper that authorized her to receive a few meager dollars a week just to keep from starving. The clerks processing her paperwork did not look up and recognize her. They asked her for her address, her employment history, her assets. She had to look them in the eye and admit that she had nothing. The system had successfully extracted the millions, and now the state was tossing her the pennies. During the 1940s, as the world plunged into the Second World War and then emerged into a completely reshaped modern era, Lillian slipped deeper into the shadows. Broadway itself had transformed. The era of the spectacular plotless revue and the silent beautiful showgirl was dead, replaced by the narrative depth of Rogers and Hammerstein. The culture had moved on to a new rhythm, and Lillian was trapped in a silent, forgotten frequency. She married briefly during the years, obscure men, marriages of convenience or sheer desperate loneliness that quickly dissolved back into her solitary routine. She had learned the hard way that men do not rescue women who have lost their capital. They only invest in assets that are appreciating. In her tiny room, she kept very few mementos. There are stories, whispered by the few historians who bothered to track her final years, that she kept a small, fading scrapbook of her follies clippings. But one has to wonder if looking at those yellowed, crumbling newspaper articles provided comfort, or if they were instruments of self-inflicted torture. To look at a photograph of yourself at 19, draped in diamonds and radiating absolute invincible power while sitting on a sagging mattress in a freezing, rat-infested room, is a cruelty that defies articulation. The mirrors in her cheap rooming house must have been her greatest enemies. In the dressing rooms of the New Amsterdam Theater, the mirror had been a harsh interrogator, warning her of the ticking clock. Now the mirror was the executioner, confirming that the clock had stopped entirely. It reflected back the terrible, undeniable truth of the bargain she had struck with the industry. She had sold her youth for a temporary lease on the world, and she was now living in the devastating, decades-long aftermath of the eviction. She drank to silence the memories, but the alcohol was a failing medicine. It ravaged her internal organs, compounded the agony of her spinal injuries, and isolated her further from the few people who might have offered her a shred of human dignity. She became known in her neighborhood simply as a tragic, eccentric local fixture, the limping, intoxicated woman who sometimes muttered about knowing famous people, a claim the locals surely dismissed as the sad, delusional ravings of a broken mind. No one believed her because the American dream does not permit a narrative where the queen of the follies ends up in the gutter. It violates the core myth of the culture. If you are beautiful and successful, you are supposed to be safe, but Lillian Lorraine was the living, breathing proof that the myth was a lie. Her existence in that rooming house was an indictment of the entire capitalist entertainment structure. It proved that the system does not love the artist, it loves the profit. And when the profit dries up, the humanity of the artist is completely irrelevant. She was serving a 30-year sentence for the crime of trusting the men who told her that her beauty was a permanent shield. As the 1950s dawned, America embraced a new era of manufactured optimism. Television sets flickered to life, and a new generation of platinum blonde stars like Marilyn Monroe were meticulously constructed to feed the public's insatiable appetite. The machinery of celebrity had simply upgraded its technology. The core operating system remained unchanged. Meanwhile, the original blueprint for their existence was quietly dying in the shadows. By 1955, the physical toll of a 30-year exile had reached its terminal limit. The shattered spine from her 1922 fall left Lillian Lorraine in chronic agony. The face that Florence Ziegfeld had once used to command Wall Street was now heavily worn by decades of trauma and poverty. Living in a squalid rooming house in Manhattan's East 80s, the woman who effectively invented the modern American showgirl was now in her early 60s and completely alone. By 1955, the physical toll of her 30-year exile from the Broadway stage had reached its absolute terminal limit. The human body is not designed to absorb the sheer volume of trauma that Lillian had inflicted upon it. The shattered spine from her 1922 fall had never properly healed, leaving her in chronic, unrelenting agony that dictated every painful step she took. The decades of severe, unmedicated alcoholism had ravaged her internal organs, leaving her frail, bloated, and jaundiced. The face that Florence Ziegfeld had once used to command the attention of the wealthiest men on Wall Street was now a harsh, unforgiving map of systemic failure. The heavy, dark eyes that had once stared down audiences with a reckless, insolent arrogance were now clouded with the thick, impenetrable fog of dementia and despair. She was living in a squalid rooming house in the East 80s of Manhattan, a neighborhood that at the time was a grim repository for the city's forgotten working-class poor. To look at Lillian in those final months is to look at the absolute ruthlessness of the capitalist entertainment complex. The industry operates on a strict, unspoken law of depreciation. A star is not a human being. A star is a highly leveraged asset. When the asset is generating millions of dollars in ticket sales and newspaper circulation, the industry will provide penthouses, gold-woven coats, and entire hotel floors for pets. The industry will pay for lawyers, fixers, and doctors to keep the asset functioning. But the moment the asset ceases to be profitable, the moment the spine cracks, the wrinkles deepen, and the public loses interest, the industry liquidates the holding with a terrifying sociopathic efficiency. There is no pension plan for a discarded muse. Lillian had been living on meager public assistance, a state-issued welfare check that barely covered the cost of her rent and the cheap liquor she required to numb the physical and psychological pain of her existence. The contrast between her beginning and her end is almost too violent for the human mind to process. Imagine the psychological whiplash of knowing, with absolute certainty, that you once possessed the power to stop traffic on Fifth Avenue, only to find yourself 3 decades later shivering in a freezing, unheated room, counting copper pennies to buy a loaf of bread. She had survived the Gilded Age, the Roaring Twenties, the Great Depression, and 2 world wars, but she could not survive the absolute crushing apathy of the city she had once conquered. New York does not hate its fallen stars, it simply forgets them, and that forgetting is a far more profound violence than hatred. In April 1955, the long, agonizing punishment finally concluded. Lillian Lorraine died in her squalid room. The exact circumstances of her final moments were not recorded by adoring biographers or breathless tabloid reporters, because there was no one left who cared to record them. There was no dramatic weeping monologue delivered to a crowd of devastated admirers. There was only the quiet, unremarkable cessation of a failing heart in a room that smelled of dust, ammonia, and old regrets. She was 63 years old. Her body was discovered not by a grieving lover or a loyal servant, but likely by a fatigued landlord or a passing neighbor noticing the smell of death, a grim, bureaucratic reality that befalls thousands of the anonymous urban poor every single day. When the authorities arrived to remove the body, they did not know they were handling the remains of Broadway royalty. The municipal workers who carried her down the narrow, greasy stairs of the rooming house were simply processing another welfare casualty. The paperwork was filled out with cold clinical detachment. Lillian de Jacques, deceased. There were no assets to secure, no vast estates to divide, no vaults of diamonds to catalog. The millions of dollars she had earned, the emeralds she had been gifted, the custom motor cars she had crashed, all of it had been evaporated by the relentless friction of time and addiction. The state took custody of the remains, preparing her for the ultimate final indignity of the forgotten. The funeral of Lillian Lorraine was a masterclass in the terrifying silence of the entertainment industry. When Florence Ziegfeld had died, the world mourned a titan. When Lillian died, the silence was absolute. There were no billionaires standing by the graveside. There were no theatrical producers delivering grand eulogies about her contribution to the American stage. The chorus girls of the 1950s, the young women currently dancing on the stages that Lillian had built, did not know her name, completely unaware that they were currently walking on the exact same conveyor belt that had led Lillian to the grave. She was buried in Calvary Cemetery in Queens, New York. It was a quiet, perfunctory burial. The woman who had lived her entire adolescence and early adulthood in the blinding, deafening center of the spotlight was lowered into the cold, damp earth of the outer boroughs with virtually no one to bear witness. This is the true, unvarnished legacy of the Ziegfeld machine. The story of Lillian Lorraine is not a romantic tragedy about a beautiful woman who flew too close to the sun. To frame it as a romance is to excuse the men who built the wings out of wax and handed her the matches. Her story is a searing, undeniable indictment of how capitalistic structures commodify the female body. Ziegfeld and the men of his era did not worship women. They worshiped their own ability to purchase, control, and consume women. They created an environment where a woman's entire commercial and social value was inextricably linked to her physical perfection, guaranteeing her eventual destruction the moment biology took its natural course. We look back at the 1910s and comfort ourselves with the illusion of progress. But the ghost of Lillian Lorraine haunts every modern pop star who suffers a highly publicized mental collapse under the crushing weight of public scrutiny. Her ghost haunts every social media influencer who starves herself to maintain an algorithmically approved aesthetic, terrified of the day the numbers drop. The tools of the trade have shifted from theatrical spotlights to smartphone lenses, and the pace of consumption has accelerated. But the core predatory mechanism remains entirely identical. The entertainment industry, driven by the ruthless pursuit of wealth and public consumption, still operates on the fundamental premise that a woman's youth is a natural resource to be aggressively mined, refined, sold at a premium, and eventually exhausted. Lillian Lorraine serves as a brutal historical precedent, a warning written in blood and cheap gin. She exposes the terrifying endpoint of a culture that values the aesthetic over the human, the product over the person. She was a scapegoat of beauty, systematically sacrificed on the altar of public entertainment so that men could build their empires and audiences could escape their mundane lives. The industry demanded absolute perfection, provided the alcohol required to numb the anxiety of maintaining that perfection, and then completely washed his hands of her when she broke under the pressure. You might believe that beauty is a lifetime insurance policy. You might look at the reigning queens of the current culture, draped in designer clothing and surrounded by the frantic adoration of millions, and think that they are safe. But the theater of wealth is an illusion, and the love of the public is nothing more than a temporary rental agreement for a person's youth. When the wrinkles inevitably appear, when the energy flags, and when the novelty wears off, the system will not fire them with a formal letter. The system will simply, quietly push the spotlight onto the next 18-year-old girl waiting in the wings. The former queen will be edged into the shadows, left to hold on to the fading memories of a time when she ruled the world. Lillian Lorraine, the woman who once wore a coat of woven gold and commanded the absolute attention of the American elite, died completely alone, her spine shattered, her bank account empty, and her name forgotten in a room that smelled of rot. The applause is always temporary. The silence that follows is forever.